31,000, 45,000, the story of two trains of French resistance. A podcast by Mathieu Landour-Engel. Paulin Coutelas. Un cours, a day off. 45,408. It's a chilly morning, around 7 degrees. More of a stay in the bed type of morning. For Paulin Coutelas, it could be freezing or boiling, it really doesn't matter. Today is the 28th of April 1941. It's a good day, because Paulin is going out of the Uncle internment center. 1 year earlier, in the summer of 1940, France had lost the Second World War against Germany. It was a complete debacle, a humiliation to a level barely imaginable. Paulin didn't see much of the war. It was quite the surprise for him when he heard that the French were being beaten. It was quite the surprise for everyone. The French were supposed to be the best army, so Paulin was told. He was only 8 years old during the First World War, but he remembered great stories of the French army, holding on, never giving up, always resisting. What happened then? When France and the United Kingdom declared war to Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, after the invasion of Poland, Paulin wasn't called to fight as a soldier. He was ordered to stay at his job as a carpenter for the National Train Line, the newly named SNCF. So he worked. 1 month passed, then 2, 4, 6 months. Doing his old same job, this time as a special affectation. Nothing was different, nothing changed. The same work all day long, the same trick back home every evening. He didn't know his army was losing the war. This wasn't the type of information you would hear. He heard the German attacked, but the French army fought bravely. He heard Belgium might have been occupied, but that the French army was still standing. He read that the French and British army were circled around Dunkirk and Calais. This was hard to believe. On the first day of June, Paulin was even told that Lille, a city in the north of France, was occupied. On the 3rd of June, German planes flew near Paris. It sure wasn't a good sign. That was the beginning of the end. 2 weeks of chaos followed. Crowds leaving Paris. The German troops entering the capital without resistance. The government escaping. It was such a mess. And Paulin was still at his work, confused. On the 17th of June, the Marshal Pétain, the new head of government after Paul Reynaud's resignation the night before, called for a ceasefire. The war was lost. Paulin came back home, earlier to his wife Hélène. They talked all night, trying to make sense of the events. Can Germany win the war against the best army in the world? Where is the French army? What happened? Hélène too was confused about the whole situation, but she was mostly relieved. Paulin wasn't called to fight as a soldier, he stayed close to her, at his job. He didn't have to fight, to kill, to get hurt. And then Paulin went back to work. The same job. No more special affectation, still the same job. What then? What happens when an entire country loses a war? Was the country now part of Germany? Was it occupied? Was there still a French government, or was it now German-ruled? Neither of those things happened. France was occupied, but only half of it, the north side and the west coast. France was still ruled by a French government, but there was now a good relationship, a partnership even with Germany. A collaboration. There was still a war, a world war, but France changed side. France gave in. France gave up. Back in the present, in 1941, Paulin is getting out of Uncourt, a sanitarium converted into an internment camp. He first leaves the youth area. Everyone there is in their 20s, except for Paulin already in his 30s. They all want to fight, to escape, to resist in a way or another, but Paulin wants to see his wife. So he kept quiet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't participate. And today he is rewarded. He's getting out of prison. So he moves to the entrance. He's given his old clothes. He passes the guards, the machine guns, and there he is, out of the French prison of Uncourt. And today he is rewarded. He's getting out. He moves to the entrance. He's given his old clothes. He passes the guards, the machine guns, and there he is, out of Uncourt. The sun is on his back, and he can see his shadow on the ground. There's also a second shadow, a shadow wearing a police uniform. A year earlier, in 1940, Paulin was not quiet. He didn't appreciate the German troops near his home at Rosny-sous-Bois or at work. He didn't like the fact that the hour changed at Berlin time. He certainly wasn't up for his work, helping the German army in any shape or form. He would not help fascism. He wanted to shout at every corner of every road that he didn't believe the war was over, despite the Vichy regime claiming it was. So he started to think as he used to a couple of years before, when together with some fellow co-workers from the Communist Party and other syndicates, they took it to the streets and fought for their rights, for paid holidays, for 40 hours a week instead of 45. Strikes, pamphlets, reunions, there are many ways to resist, to speak your mind. During breaks, Paulin started talking to his co-workers, to assemble committees, to speak from one strong voice rather than a multitude of quieter ones. It was hard. The German victory against France was so brutal. Most people in France had very little optimism. It felt that Germany was much stronger, unstoppable, that there was no turning back anymore. They were polite too. They didn't sack the entire country. They smiled. Sometimes they helped you carry your luggages. Very few of his co-workers agreed with Paulin. Very few agreed with someone too close to the Communist Party. It's not that Hélène disagreed, but she was worried about Paulin. Maybe he was being too vocal about his opinion. Sure, his voice mattered back in 1936 during the massive strikes, yet this was different. This was about the German troops. This might get dangerous. And Hélène was pregnant with their first child. Paulin couldn't be happier about the news. Parents, they will become parents. Everything was different now. Paulin wanted to do anything for Hélène, to help her in any way. A baby is a great change in the family. The Vichy regime wanted to maintain order, and the communists were an issue, even to previous governments. Accused to be anti-France against the war on the German side, to influence the soldiers to stop fighting and to throw the country into defeat, the Marshal Pétain was also worried of the communist propaganda and wished to get rid of the problem for good. Forbidding the Communist Party was not enough. Forbidding all communist print wasn't either. Now the communists needed to be taken away. They needed to be detained. The most dangerous elements, the most actives were to be arrested. Yet, since the declaration of war and the occupation, the list of the communist elements were not up to date. Some were written as dangerous for participating to strikes back in the 30s. Some were only on those lists because they subscribed to the Communist Party. It didn't seem to matter. To Vichy's eyes, any communist was a dangerous one. The Uncourt Sanatorium, previously a center for tuberculosis patients evacuated in June 1940, seemed ideal for a reconversion as an internment camp, or a stay center under surveillance, so not to sound suspicious. The camp became the first of its kind in France, the first internment camp in the occupied zone, run by the Vichy regime. Right in the middle of a forest, 70 kilometers away from Paris, Close to a train station yet not so easily accessible for the prisoners and their families, Uncourt had many qualities for the authorities, and it truly didn't matter if the prisoners felt isolated, crammed to a point where they were confined in a canteen converted into a sleeping area. On the 26th of October 1940, Paulin was arrested as a consequence of the 18th of September decree, stating that anyone presenting a danger for the nation could be arrested and jailed indefinitely. Paulin was communist. He also had been reported by someone at his work for speaking his mind, and like 40 people that day, he was arrested and sent to the Uncourt Center. No evidence was necessary, no trial, no sentence, no appeal. He was just arrested and brought to Uncourt, detained, under surveillance, indefinitely. Now, back to the present. Paulin is out of Uncourt, taking a train from Mantes to his hometown, Rosny-sous-Bois. He behaved for the last 6 months. Not one word about Germany, about France, about anything really. Paulin is about to meet his daughter, Claudie, who was born on the 22nd of March. Hélène was so brave. She was all alone, pregnant, without Paulin, without work, doing her best. She sent letters to the local prefect, and all thanks to her, Paulin came out of Uncourt. He was finally free. For one single day. Free for one day to get his clothes, to get out of Uncourt, to take a train from Mantes to Rosny-sous-Bois, then to see his wife, to meet his daughter, and finally to leave around 6:30 and make the journey back to Uncourt. 6 months of good behavior, of promises to never be part of the Communist Party, to say nothing about France or Germany. 6 months of letters from Hélène to the prefect, begging for her husband to come back at his old job and help the family. His reward for all that was one day. But today is still a good day. Maybe chilly, but his heart is already warm. Hélène is at the station waiting for him. Claudie is here too, in a small wooden stroller. Finally, they meet. They have so much to talk about. Is Claudie feeling well? Does she eat enough with all the rationing in France? How is Hélène? Is she not depriving herself of food so Claudie has enough? Paulin needs to thank Hélène's parents for all their help. His parents too, and his brothers of course, Gustave and Isidore. Paulin is not sure he'll have enough time. Hélène is so happy, yet she can't help contain her anger as she realizes that Paulin is not alone. There is a shadow in uniform next to him, and the shadow is staying. They spend time, they talk about anything but politics or war. The shadow is listening. It doesn't matter. There is so much more to talk about. Paulin and Hélène kiss in front of the shadow. They care about Claudie in front of the shadow. They eat with the shadow. This is what it feels like during the Second World War in France. You live with a shadow listening to you, watching you, spying on your intimacy. The shadow isn't easy too. He wishes he wasn't there either. This is too intimate. He feels like an elephant in a room. Its presence should at least be acknowledged, yet it won't. Elephant or shadow, he's following orders. He can't wait for his day to end. To stop being a shadow and be with his wife and kids. To forget about all this. Elephant, shadow or policeman. The day ends soon. Time to say goodbye already. Hélène is hopeful that Paulin will be released soon, for good this time. Paulin is not as hopeful. This might be the last time he sees his family, and the only time he sees his daughter. In the train back to Uncourt, Paulin stares at the policeman, as if he was staring at his country. We lost the war, but we didn't have to bow to the enemy like that. Not like that. Thank you for listening to the first episode of 31,000, 45,000, the story of two trains of French members of the Resistance. Today I talked about Paulin Coutelas, a man who lived in Rosny-sous-Bois, a city close to Paris. Paulin Coutelas was my grand-uncle. I just wanted to include here a few more informations about him. First, my sources are the book Red Triangles in Auschwitz by Claudine Cardon-Hamet, the website Mémoire Vive, and a conversation I had with Claudie Trocmet, the daughter of Hélène and Paulin Coutelas. Paulin Coutelas was indeed arrested on the 26th of October 1940 and stayed at the Incourt Center for some time. The Incourt internment camp was a sanitarium converted by the French government on the 5th of October 1940. It was put in place in order to imprison members of the Communist Party. When France was invaded by Germany in June 1940, the French government was in peril and moved to Bordeaux in the south, then in Vichy. The president, Albert Lebrun, kept his position at first, yet the equivalent of the Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigned and was replaced by Philippe Pétain, who at the time was considered a hero of the First World War by the French population. He was the one who called for a ceasefire and would later create a new regime, the Vichy regime, replacing even Albert Lebrun. The country was then divided in two parts, both ruled by the Vichy regime, yet the north and west coast was occupied by the German army. The south part wasn't. This will change a couple of years later. One of the consequences of the occupation was that France changed time, literally, and moved to the German hour, the Berlin time. So rather than being 4 p.m., it was 5 p.m. The Berlin time is still nowadays in place in France. Paulin Coutelas was indeed able to get out of the Incourt Center for one day, on the 28th of April 1941, and he met his daughter Claudie, who was a couple of months old at the time. I don't know precisely what happened that day, only that Paulin went back to his home to spend time with his family and was accompanied at all times by a French policeman. He might have been able to escape that day, yet he made no attempt. I wish to thank you for your attention. Next episode will be about Robert Philippot and the Pact of Non-Aggression. 31,000, 45,000, the story of two trains of French resistance. A podcast by Mathieu Landour-Engel.